Thanks for coming, everybody, in the graveyard shift. So this workshop is actually a presentation based on a teaching innovation grant that we had in collaboration with a number of people who are going to be presenting today. And so I'm going to hopefully get as fast as we can to their very cool stories. And so the original team was myself, I'm Deb Brown, Dr. Peter Ellerton and Dr. Yael Lebovich, who unfortunately is looking after a sick child, so couldn't be here today, but she might be online. And then we had collaborators, Professor Gwen Laurie, Dr. Adam Lacaze, Professor Mark Midwinter, and then Professor Vincent Wheatley. Vince is coming a bit later because he's in a workshop till 4, so he's on his way over here now. But just before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders and ancestors. I acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land upon which we meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're always mindful that this has been a place of teaching and learning long before there was a university here. And we recognise Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders people's valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So I'm going to here's the structure of this. I'm going to talk very briefly about the UQ Critical Thinking Project, which is what is in the background of the Teaching Innovation Grant that we've had for the past 2 years to enhance assessment and also learning through embedding critical thinking across the curriculum. Then I'm going to hand it to Peter to talk about the pedagogical approach that we took in this collaborative project. But what the critical thinking project is about, our mission is essentially to promote critical thinking for the public good. And we do that through interacting with educators, both in the schooling sector and also at the university, and also, with corporations and government organisations and so on. Critical thinking is, as we know, a global education priority. It's a graduate attribute here at UQ. It's part of the Australian National Curriculum. But there hasn't been a lot of work done on how to embed or develop critical thinking across the curriculum. And for educators who are not trained in philosophical or critical thinking, this is a real challenge. And this is the space in which our project team works. Peter's going to talk to you about our specific pedagogy, which is the Teaching for Thinking, or T4T pedagogy. The other thing that we do is we support a lot of marginalised or underserved communities through courses and on-campus event days for students. So we're really focused on what Mary Graham was talking about this morning, about getting philosophical and critical thinking in schools. And we're finding that really helps with the transition from school to university, and helps improve access and also performance and preparedness for university amongst students. We have extensive collaborations with Department of Education schools, the Brisbane Catholic Ed, a number of independent schools. So basically our work is represented in over 350 schools in Queensland alone, international schools and also international educators. And we have Dr. Ebony Kane over there from Pepperdine University, who works in educational leadership, and Professor Calvin Normore from UCLA, who are two of our international partners on this project as well. We also have collaborations with the Australian Federal Police. So the work we've been doing in this Teaching Innovation Grant is aligned with national educational priorities, and those are around improving access to education, improving the quality of educational outcomes, and also skills development. It aligns with UQ mission and vision statements, values, goals, strategic alignments, and also with the assessment review recommendations. Our work is a core part of the Queensland commitment, given that we work across all educational regions in the state to help improve academic preparedness for students and aspiration for coming to university through that academic preparedness. And our work is correlated with significant relative gains, both by UQ students and also by school students who we're helping to get to university in the first place. So this is just a little graph showing the results of students who take the Introduction to Critical Thinking course, which is Phil 1110, in their first semester of their first year. And this is data aggregated across all degree programs. This is not representing just philosophy majors. And you can see that there is a significant relative gain in GPA from students who take that course in their first semester of their first year. And we also see higher retention rates, higher GPA, and higher completion rates within 3 years of students who were in our course for school students, which is called RIT 1999, Effective Thinking and Writing, and that's just for students who are from low SES schools or are Indigenous students. So that's what we do. So why did we embark on this Teaching Innovation Grant? Well, we did so, and it's important to notice that we did so before generative AIs became the problem that we're all dealing with. This project was developed in response to a sense that too much of assessment was based on recall or the testing of procedural knowledge, the testing of the applications of algorithms to get that one right result of a problem, when preparing students for many workplaces actually requires that they be able to think about a diversity of solutions and to be able to justify one solution out of many. So the idea was that we would sort of work together to figure out how we might shift the focus of teaching and learning in such a way that we were presenting extant knowledges as open or contentious or unsettled, and give students the ability to work with justifying, one solution among many rather than always just finding that one right answer. The move to online during COVID also prompted a lot of our thinking about this project and all the challenges that we faced collectively around integrity as a lot of assessment moved to the online space. So we were thinking about how we could design assessment differently so that we were capturing students' reasoning rather than their ability to produce that one right answer. And then, of course, generative AI came along and it made our work even more relevant. So just to kind of give you the pedagogical foundation, I'm going to call on Peter now to talk about how that approach to assessment came out of this pedagogical approach.
Thanks very much, Deb. Our concern in the critical thinking project when we're working with educators is the concept of schematic understanding, the basis of expertise at any kind of context. But what is the schematic representation of teaching people to think well? And what does that even mean? What kind of language do we have around that? What kind of conceptual frameworks do we have that speaks to that? Not only that, but can speak to it regardless of context, regardless of your discipline area, regardless indeed of your year level, although we work a lot with educators at university. We also work with educators in primary school and in high school as well. And we don't see that much of a differentiation in terms of the pedagogical approach. It's just its instantiation. So in that case, it's a discipline neutral approach to teaching for thinking. But one thing I want to say about that immediately is to sort of challenge any false dichotomy that we have the option of teaching content or teaching people to think well. Okay. We don't see this as a dichotomy. It's Dewey's great phrase that thinking is the method of intelligent learning. So we're asking ourselves, how do we integrate these projects? And in fact, the evidence really strongly suggests that the best way to achieve both is with each other. Okay, so these are not co-targets in a sense. They're kind of one target. And it does mean that we highly value content. There is no minimization of the value of content knowledge. It's hard won. We ought to respect it, and we ought to have it at the centre of what we do, one of the things at the centre of what we do. But we also want students to engage with that content, and that is a cognitive engagement. And what we want to do is to map out that kind of engagement with the kind of intentionality and precision that will allow us to construct meaningful learning experiences and assessment packages. Okay. Knowing exactly what we're doing at every stage in terms of what we want the cognitive demands on students to be. We also want to be making sure that we can give students feedback. Now, we all know the value of feedback in our content area, but for us, the critical aspect is feedback on the quality of student thinking. So what we have to do is figure out what that means. not just progression through the task, but actually interrogating, recognising, engaging with and speaking with students about their thinking as it happens. Because that's how we improve, with targeted feedback. And we're talking about the quality of thinking. But we also recognise there's no point talking about critical thinking unless you're thinking about the critical thinker. The person matters. The thinker is the end game. So how is it that we can then, through this process, grow a range of virtues in students that helps them to become the lifelong learners we need them to become autonomous, to free them, if you like, from not just the temptation to use AI in the wrong way, but for them to see it as a useful tool, or at worst, or at best, in fact, something that they use as a backup. Okay. So they rely on themselves more than they rely on anything else. Okay. Their own understanding of inquiry is what we're after. So those kind of virtues of open-mindedness and resilience and persistence and so on, intellectual honesty, curiosity in particular, are what's at the base of what we work on, delivering those things. So in that context, our Teaching Innovation Grant focused particularly on assessment design and assessment design on cognitive activity. So from that broad project, we are focusing more on assessment using cognition. And in that sense, that's how we define inquiry learning. Okay, inquiry learning are those activities which demand of students a broad and deep range of cognitive skills. Cognitive activity is the goal here. Inquiry is not defined by the kind of thing it is, it's defined by the demands it makes on students. And again, it's that precision and intentionality that we want to talk to. Way around. To give you a sense of some of the things that we might do here, one of the devices we have is an alternative to Bloom's taxonomy, which has a striking inertia and persistence in the university and in education all round. But we know the hierarchical nature of Bloom's is wrong because Bloom said so, and so has Mazzano and many others, okay? Empirically and logically, there is no hierarchy between the cognitions. More of that later, if you like. So the device we use here to work with people is the notion of the cognitive web model, where we see the cognitions as nodes on a web, and when you pull on one, you will pull on others. Because we don't just do one cognitive activity in isolation from the others. There's a connection between them all. And importantly, we've identified, through our work with teachers, 4 really important ones. In no particular order, because it's not a hierarchy. Analyse, evaluate, justify, and explain. And I don't have time to justify and explain why we've chosen those 4 today. That's not really the purpose of it all. But I can say that one of the critical things of that set of skills, which we call the golden tetrad of cognitive skills, is that over time, they pull in just about every other skill you'll need. And they are at the centre of argumentation, which is at the centre of critical thinking, the evaluative justificatory work of argumentation. So this is a great way of auditing our work. And that's one of the first things that we do with people, is we conduct what we call a cognitive audit. Let's have a look at your assessment piece and your learning design and identify the cognitive demands that go into that. And that's a very detailed process. We want students to be at least as concerned with what they do with their knowledge as they are with just having it, and the process by which they gain that knowledge and create for themselves, at least, new knowledge. And that involves things like critical questioning. And of course, it's a matter of making them agents, which is at the core of lifelong learning. Critically as well, those 4 skills are very well placed to develop collaboratively. So we see this as one of the key mechanisms of collaboration, and there's a lot we do in terms of collaboration. This then helps us to work towards assessment design and to develop questions and scenarios that, as Deb was saying before, test their students' reasoning, their inferential capabilities, their evaluative skills, and their ability to justify. And that's what we've been working on thus far. Now, yeah, I think we'll skip that. I was going to say, you could consider some questions below here. You ever ask your students to critically analyse and critically evaluate? How is that different to, anyway, conversations to be had. And we had some examples I was going to show you from engineering, but we'll move on, I think. Okay, so back to Deb.
Yeah, so just quickly, what the project involved was we formed this cross-disciplinary collaborative team, and we've got 4 representatives from that collaborative group here to talk to you today. But it was actually broader than that, and every single faculty was represented in that core group. We held a range of workshops, including workshops on how to do a cognitive audit on your assessment. But I just want to reiterate something that Peter hinted at there, was that although this project was initially around about assessment, we soon realised that you couldn't just kind of plonk all this critical thinking into your assessment if you hadn't developed it throughout the course. So it became this larger project about how you design, your learning experiences for your students, so you're preparing them for that kind of assessment. And it turned out to be this quite, holistic and very rich project as a result. We provided mentoring to our collaborators, and we had, that sort of ongoing collaboration, feedback, analysis, and also modification of student assessment artifacts and so on. And we also ran a research and evaluation project alongside it, where we collected a lot of particularly qualitative data around the implementation of the pedagogical approach. And just, in terms of what we found as a result of that research and evaluation, these were the dominant themes that collaborators valued this shared pedagogical approach, the fact that people from very diverse disciplines representing different faculties at the university could have a discussion around teaching that was discipline neutral and focused on student cognition and also their metacognition as well. That the community of practice was really valued across the university, but also collaborators would then create communities of practice within their discipline areas or within their schools, and that was very valuable. That there was improved assessment design, and that people felt they really were collecting, actually capturing their students' thinking more than they had done before. That this was a bit of an antidote to generative AIs, because the one thing that AI can't do is evaluate an argument. That it aligned nicely with graduate attributes, and it aligns very well with graduate attributes, the new graduate attributes as well. And that, interestingly, Mary Graham this morning was talking about conscience, and it was very interesting to reflect on how the intellectual virtues that we emphasise in this project align with, ethical values and dispositions as well. And that finally, that the resources, because they were discipline neutral, had a high degree of transferability across the whole university. And there are basically 2 ways to approach the teaching of critical thinking in a discipline. One is through a kind of standalone course like the Introduction to Critical Thinking, which I've shown you actually does significantly improve student outcomes on its own. But that's sort of limited in terms of its effects. And it's much better to actually be developing critical thinking across the disciplines and embedding it in the learning of the knowledge and methodologies of a discipline. So those were the main findings. And now we're going to see how individuals applied this pedagogy in their particular educational context, starting off with the brilliant and amazing Professor Gwen Laurie from Chemistry and Molecular Biosciences. Put it together for Gwen.
It's a little bit too excited an introduction.
No, they need it. It's right.
Okay, I'll get some energy going. So it's been a pleasure to work with the team over the last couple of years, and I confess that we've worked a little bit longer because these guys were critical friends to a project that we were running before this one. So this is like a continuation of work that we've been doing for a while. So basically, this is in a course with 1,000 students. And scale is always a challenge in terms of assessing critical thinking or those types of non-testing exam-based questions and problem solving. So what we have here is a task where we actually get students to use chemistry explanations. And one of the things we don't often do is actually get students to use the language, the vocabulary around their learning. So, excuse me, suffering a cold. So the task is basically, we call it Think, Chat, Learn, but all it is a collaborative discourse. So it's about getting students to interact with each other. We talked to Peter raised the idea of collaboration being important for getting students to engage in critical thinking. We give them a real world video. It's typically 3 minutes long, and they do an individual explanation of what they see in terms of chemistry concepts. And then they queue like they're going into a bus managed to a platform that's been developed by Ellipse here at UQ. And once they're in a group of 4, they see all the other students' explanations, and then they enter in a discourse, a conversation as a group to come up with the best explanation. So they're looking at each other's interpretations, they're making arguments, that they're considering what might be right, they're asking questions, drawing on new things, which are all the elements of the assessment framework. Once they've developed a shared or agreed explanation, they move on to reflection. And that's really important because they think about how their original explanation has changed or not based on the process of working with the other team members and whether their conceptions are fit. So it takes around about 30 minutes. It's managed entirely online. It was set up before COVID. So this became a really valuable task for us, and it still works really well. However, working with the critical thinking team, we've improved the assessment, and that's, I think, the purpose of the project, improve the alignment. So you'll see the verbs down the left-hand column that relate back to the web, the cognitive web as such, in terms of we assess students in terms of their individual component as well as their group process component. So the first few boxes are around the individual. So the analyzing, so looking at the video, explaining what they're seeing, interpreting, explaining. This is given to students before they embark on the task, so they know what we're looking for. They're having to think about what represents a good explanation. We give them an example of a good or a bad discussion as well. So interpreting. And then the reflection at the end is the metacognition piece. I've put it here because it's an individual part of the task. And then we have the group work component where they're evaluating. So they're looking at each other's explanations, trying to make meaning, looking at common threads through that, making arguments, justifying or making claims, providing evidence to support those claims. And we also look at the accuracy, whether they're actually going the right way and explaining what they've seen in the video. And you could see a couple of examples. They're real world contexts, things of chemistry happening in the real world. There's an example, we've done analysis of the discourse, and so you can see an example of the exchanges. Each student's given a different color code on the right, and we look for evidence of the chemistry thinking as well as the critical thinking around this. So this is all facilitated through a platform which makes it easy for a coordinator, 1,000 students to mark. So those statements before on the rubric convert into click boxes on the platform. And on the left, you can see one individual student's submission. So you have if I can make the light work, not going to work. Yes, at the top is their first explanation. They have a confidence scale, how confident they are in their explanation. And then we can see all the group's interactions, and then we see their reflection at the end. We mark each student using the rubric, this process. So it's very well structured for the instructor or the tutors to do this marking. The rubric appears on the right-hand side with the different levels that we gave in the printed rubric or the actual framework that was given to students before the task. So that's my example. Thank you.
Now we have Adam Lacasse from pharmacy. Yeah. And you might talk also about your practice as well. You did pharmacy.
So thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the School of Pharmacy with regard to learning activities and assessment in the language of student cognition. Context for us is that we're about 2/3 of the way through a fairly large curriculum redesign. So the objectives for that has been to switch to a blended model of delivery, adopt an assessment profile that's far more focused on application of decision-making, and transform our work integrated learning strategy. A key driver in the review of the curriculum and what we're trying to achieve has been a recognition that we had to be much better in how we were supporting the students in their thinking skills and decision making. So that ran right through the whole curriculum redesign. The reason for that is that pharmacy practice has changed over the last couple of decades. There's a far greater focus on clinical skills as opposed to those traditional pharmacist technical skills, moving away from dispensing and compounding medicines to collaborating as part of a team to ensure the wise use of medicines with patients. Like, that change has been going on for 20 years, but education kind of has a lag. And we very much recognize, and I think, you know, pharmacy in general recognize, that we need to do better at supporting right from day one, students understanding that clinical decision-making skills. And central to that is being able to think well and make decisions and justify those decisions. What we did, so we had those objectives before participating in the TIG. We're very fortunate that those objectives aligned very well with what the TIG was doing. So really what the TIG gave us was the how. So we had the objective. We knew we wanted to do better with regard to supporting students to make good decisions and do better in their critical thinking, both in our learning activities and assessment. But to be honest, the resource that we had available to us wasn't helping us with the how. So the participation in the TIG helped that. And particularly the pedagogical imperatives of the pedagogical schema, right? So shifting the focus from knowledge to inquiry, thinking and planning in the language of student cognition, and working collaboratively when thinking can be shared. So I said before, one of our objectives was to switch our mode of delivery to blended from a traditional lecture and tutorial model. Well, there's a million ways to blend. And what this gave us was the structure for how we're going about designing those online activities and how we're linking them to those face-to-face activities when the students were in. So some of the activities we did, again, Deb mentioned the community of practice. So a lot of it was focused on capacity building within the School of Pharmacy. We had a real lot of support for increasing our focus on critical thinking, but again, we kind of needed the help on the how. So within our teaching staff, we had workshops, a series of workshops on teaching for thinking. We also had a look specifically on assessment design and bringing the cognitive skills and being very specific about the cognitive skills into our assessment approaches, as well as bringing in the values of inquiry in our feedback. We did a range of things with the curriculum implementation. That's still ongoing, but we explicitly introduced the cognitive skills and the values inquiry into our discussions with our year one students from semester one. And we've done a fair bit of work, and it's ongoing, in embedding those cognitive skills in the assessment tasks, like being much more specific and intentional about them, and also bringing the values of inquiry into our assessment rubrics. The outcomes for us, like I've said it a couple of times, the big thing is that the tools and expertise that inform the pedagogical schema have been super helpful for us. It's given us our how. We had the same objective, but we were less clear on the how. And looking around, the other tools available to us aren't as good. They don't have the rigor and they don't have the practical guidance on implementing this stuff. So we found that super helpful. We've also found through the discussions we've had within the school and with the students that we're developing that shared language around critical thinking. So that's helpful when you've got a group of academics all working across the curriculum, all with slightly different focuses and areas of expertise, to have a shared language on critical thinking. It's not that everyone wasn't already doing something and that there was a lot of skill already, but it wasn't as intentional and it wasn't as specific in our language around how we're talking about fostering these skills in students and then assessing them. The next steps for us, like this is a longer term project. So we've got another couple of years left of implementing our curriculum redesign. So we have to continue the capacity building project. Some of this is kind of setting things up so we can do more in the future. Some of that is, the ways in which we can build more space in our face-to-face teaching. So we've got time for the discussions that we need to have with students rather than being so content heavy. And that's a flip, and that flip takes a little while. We're looking to embed some of the tools that we've used and discussed a little bit around cognitive audit into our quality assurance processes around the courses. And our next steps are evaluating the process outcomes and student outcomes. Thanks.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to come up? But just on that issue about that shared meta language, so what this pedagogy enables, you as educators to do with your students is, when you say something like, your analysis was accurate but not precise, or it was relevant but not significant, the student knows what you mean. So you get that much more effective feedback, but that language has to be shared with the students. And the more it's shared across your teaching teams, as Adam was suggesting, the more powerful it is, because then the student goes from one class to the next and it's like, oh, they're using the language in the same way. They're using the same values of inquiry. They're using the same cognitive verbs in the same way. So it's hugely powerful. But now, Mark Midwinter from Biomedical Sciences.
Thank you, Deb. Yeah, this has been a very interesting journey, and we're still on this journey. As you can see, I'm from the School of Biomedical Sciences, not the medical school, but just like pharmacy, the medical program is undergoing a redesign. So I'm sort of part of that, but from outside the school who owns the program. Now, can't see the... Anyway, the problem is about clinical decision-making is medical students came to it late, and they come to it in the clinical environment, and all of that is driven by heuristics, and they did get very little exposure to critical thinking in its sort of formal sense. And we started to look at how we might address that, and developed a critical thinker, scientist and scholar theme right from day one for the medical program. So when they come into the medical program, it's the first thing they hit. And they have this year, there's the first iteration for year one, and they had a 4-week transition to the MD. So they hadn't even really started year one. They were just coming in and learning about the whole program. And the idea was to move away from that learning clinical decision-making by being in the clinical environment where it's largely heuristic-driven, to actually having some understanding of critical thinking and hypothesis generation, because they don't have the exposure to clinical cases or experience to be able to jump to that, which they'll see from their sort of senior mentors. So this transition to the MD, as I say, it's before they even start year one, included 4 3-hour workshops facilitated through the Critical Thinking Project. And that was really, really valuable, because it actually sets them up before they even meet patients and before they meet clinicians, so that they can think about how people are arriving at decisions, how they're sort of thinking and interpreting that clinical information and investigations. And it included things like what is expertise, what makes a good doctor, argumentation. Actually, it was quite enlightening to see how they changed their approach to deconstructing sort of arguments, looking at biases, falsification, communication through that accountable talk and the values of inquiry, all really gave that language. And I think language is really critical for this, because you could see the students changing in the way they talked about clinical scenarios, which was very interesting. Assessment was harder. You could see this was the part of the MD design for the new MD. It's first year is called Foundations of Medicine. They break it into knowledge, skills base, and professionalism engagement. We were sort of constrained this year to be assessing within the knowledge domain, of which they had these cumulative assessment tests. And that's what we were allowed to use as our assessment platform. And I'll come on to say why I don't think that was optimal. But in the clinical skills, they have assessment of direct observation of procedural skills, mini case examinations, and then professionalism, they have different assessments, as you can see along there. So we were a little bit constrained in this laydown, which was actually given to us. So how could we do that? Well, that meant that we had to use MCQs. And I realized actually how difficult it is to assess reasoning and critical reasoning through MCQs. I think it is, I found it terribly difficult. But we wanted to ensure we could assess what they had done. And we always put it around a clinical scenario to try and see if they could break that down. How is that sort of scenario leading to decisions? So this one's a patient presenting with lower abdominal pain with no ovarian cysts, and are the cysts the cause of the pain? Is that really a good way of making that argument? And for example, another one about a delayed diagnosis because of some sort of framing effect, whether they could just recognize this. Now, the problem with this is, I think, we can't deconstruct their reasoning very effectively. And the other limitation, I would say, is I think it's good to have that foundation right at the beginning, because they come across those sort of scenarios over the first year, okay, and obviously through subsequent years. But their knowledge at that point is so limited that the scenarios obviously have to be relatively obvious and simple, because they don't have any direct experience. So, but we wanted to make it, give it some sort of face validity, as it were, with those scenarios. Future directions, what I'm trying to do through the various, through the Academy of Medical Education, is instead of having it limited to MCQs, actually make it part of objective structured clinical exams, which they'll go into from year 2. So we can continue this on through the subsequent 4 years of the program, building it into future years as they gain that clinical knowledge and experience, so they'll be able to have a more nuanced scenarios and a better evaluation of thinking in a more realistic sense. Thanks.
So I don't think Vince is here. And I guess he's gotten lost or stuck or something or other. And I'm not going to speak for him, but I'm just going to flick through his slides so that you can see that he is from mechatronics. And so he has applied this work in that space. Maybe he will come in as we go along. But do you want to say anything about Vince? No. Okay, you want to go this one?
I will.
This one?
Back. No, back.
Going backwards.
Because you're pressing the forwards button. It's critical thinking in action.
School for the gifted. So it'll be, can we make it bigger again? That one? That one? Which one?
Yep, there we go. Thanks, Chris. No, the one that has all those aspects listed.
What we learned?
That's it, slide 8, I think.
Sorry.
That'll do the job.
This one?
No, next one behind, back. Before. Yep, that's it. Keep going, that one. Yep, keep going. That's it.
Okay.
That's the good one. Yeah, okay. So one of the, teaching for thinking is a very complex thing. So there's a range of devices that we have that sort of give people a sort of a handle on things. And this is one of the things that we use as a bit of an audit of educational experiences and indeed of assessment. So, can we point to in this particular activity or piece where students are identifying and challenging assumptions? And where do they construct and evaluate their arguments? And these are the conversations that were quite fascinating to have. I think it was with Vince and with Jeanette from classics. So you had the engineer and the classicist talking to each other about how they did that and sort of nodding and going, oh yeah, we did this in this way, and it was really fascinating to hear that conversation going on from people from such diverse subject area backgrounds. And that's, I think, what's really quite powerful about, the focus on teaching for thinking. And the way in which people address these situations, I thought, was really innovative and intriguing. But it was worth the professional conversation just to hear about that kind of context. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
Maybe we could get everybody up the front and have a little Q&A. Come on, team. You two, get up here. Questions. And by the way, I'll just say, I mean, even though the grant is officially finished, we would love to keep working with everybody on the project, and anybody who wants to join our merry band is more than welcome to do so as well. The more the merrier, eh? So any questions? Yes, I'm over you first. Greg, right? Do you want the thingy? I suppose I should I?
Thank you. So with the pharmacy example, there was an interesting phrase, accountable talk. And I know what those two words mean separately, but I'm wondering what they mean together in your example.
So accountable talk. So one person that's worth having a conversation with this about is Yao, who might be online or not. But accountable talk is an approach in teaching face-to-face where you're making the thinking explicit with students. So the accountable part is that students are accountable for their teaching. So it's if you Google it, there's a whole bunch of resources which are really helpful and about setting up and some STEM questions to get students like thinking and collaborating about their thinking. And the idea about accountable talk is the setting up the situation so that you have those kind of conversations. And there's a whole bunch of helpful suggestions for it. I'll hand to.
No, it's part of the dialogic teaching approach. I mean, it's exactly as Adam was saying. It's about getting students to think, but there are specific kinds of questions that you can ask, to say, can you extend your thinking, right? Can you respond to that, right? Where you're getting students to respond to one another. So you, at the front of the classroom, turn out to be more of a facilitator of students' collaborative reasoning than, the font of wisdom who answers all their questions. But there are specific talk moves about how you can do that effectively in the classroom to extend or challenge their thinking. And Yael's thesis, so Yael did a lot of work mentoring people in the team and also collaborating and facilitating workshops and so on. And her thesis was on how if you teach students argument structures and do dialogic thinking, how that dramatically improves their writing and their intentionality around their writing. So if anybody's interested in improving writing capabilities, there's a really nicely well-established connection between these teaching methods, critical thinking, and improved writing outcomes.
Hello, I would be curious to hear a little bit more about the reactions of students to these kinds of moves. And I'm particularly curious about this because of a recent experience I had. I co-teach as a physicist into a second-year physiotherapy course called where I'm hopefully helping them understand the fundamental physics that informs physiotherapy. And at a revision session, so we're trying to frame this more in make decisions about, is this practice safe? Is this practice effective? And in a revision session, the physiotherapist academic said to the group, don't rote learn things. And there was an audible intake of breath across the whole group. And I'm thinking that physiotherapists and pharmacy and medicine students are quite likely to be similar and coming from a background of being high achievers, and perhaps they've been high achievers partly supported by rote learning. Hence my question, what's the reaction of students to this emphasis on critical thinking?
Well, we were doing this right at the beginning, as I said, of the medical program. And actually, that was something I wondered. And I've been following that cohort, obviously, as I've been teaching them over the first year. And actually, the reaction was hugely positive. and you saw them change. And I'd just like to go back to the accountable talk, because I focused on our formal assessment. But one of the other things we've developed within the new Year 1 curriculum is team-based learning. So they have sessions where they first of all do a thing called an individual rated assessment, I think it's called, an IRAT, and then they have a discussion in their group, and they actually form a TRAT, a team assessment of, you know, what was strong, what was weak. And actually that has, they've thoroughly enjoyed that. Now, what would be interesting is how that translates into clinical practice. But I understand what you're saying, because I teach anatomy and pathology, and anatomy particularly is traditionally been very much rote learning, although you can structure it differently, where people actually have a deeper understanding and of the sort of development and morphology. And I've seen that that has changed the way they've approached the subject. But having said that, I think there's still a significant cohort who will just try and rote learn, but they don't perform as well generally. So I think, yeah, it's been positive.
I would just say in the evaluation, students were very positive about the critical thinking. Or just remember, I mean, I know it's anecdotal, but there was one great comment, which was, I now know how to be a good doctor. I will look for disconfirming evidence of my initial hypothesis rather than confirming evidence. We might just be all saved. Would you like to say something about student feedback? Yeah.
Well, not really, because we don't actually have those discussions in a room in person where the students can, but they do enjoy the task in actually connecting to the real world. So and asking questions of that. So I think I've got a lot to add to that particular aspect of that.
Like a quick thing on the student response, it's been mixed for us. I was surprised. Overall, everyone is really positive. In the first run, where I think we didn't quite scaffold it as well, that switch from rote learning to critical thinking was an existential crisis for a small number of students. So we've had to bring a lot of that stuff forward, and like getting learning advisors involved and talking about modes of thinking. And so there's a range of ways we could do so that we could support the students and get them more ready for it. And we found we had to do that for a small percentage of students, but they had a really strong reaction.
Any other questions?
Hello.
Hey, Chris. He's a member of our happy family.
Yeah, so I was just, Margaret, I was thinking about that question. I wondered how much was it about like letting the students know how much they're going to get out of it, is how much, you know, how much that contributes to them feeling better about it. But I have a question that you're probably going to hate me for. What have you learned in this process that we could take to adapt our assessment or think about how generative AI, how does generative AI fit into this picture of critical thinking?
Right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, the one thing that generative AI can't do is evaluate an argument. I mean, there's many things it can't do, right? But you know, but that is one thing. So focusing assessment on students' ability to justify points, to, you know, to evaluate arguments is one way to test their inferential capabilities beyond what generative AI can do. And then you can sort of think about ways in which generative AI can be used positively, to support learning if it's reliable enough to even do that. But it really does get down to the level of, you know, how are we going to, what are we actually testing in assessment? Are we testing students' knowledge, the extant knowledge, you know, and then if that's all we're doing, then they are going to rely on AI, and that's really dangerous because that's just not only garbage in, garbage out, but also meta garbage added to the garbage. So, you know, generative AI is generative garbage, right? So that's always a problem. Hey, here's Vince. Maybe Vince wants to also have a little go in a minute, but yeah, that would be great actually if we could. Can I all sort of beg your indulgence to get Vince to say a few things? But Peter, I just wondered on this question of AI, whether you wanted to say something just to finish off the question.
Oh, gosh. Oh, God, it's dropped me in it, hasn't it? Is the recording off? Good. No, well, we can't, none of us can be at this stage as profound as we'd like to be about this and make definitive comments. But I think that notion of being evaluative is really important. Now, the AI can give you criteria for evaluation of things that already exist, but, you know, it doesn't do that well in novel scenarios. And that's a really important idea. So novelty, as we've seen before, novelty, case-based, but not just having something case-based that's, you know, specific to that assessment piece, but the kind of reasoning associated with that. That's what we want to target. And that's, I think, a safer space to be in.
Okay, Vince from mechanical and mining engineering. Yay, Vince, who was stuck in another workshop.
Oh, so I was at Black Card Cultural Training, which I highly recommend. It was amazing. They asked us to put our phones and watches away, so we gave adequate time to it. But don't have a room full of academics having an open-ended discussion with no phones and watches and other means of telling time. It's going to be very productive, but maybe long. Just on that AI point, I asked ChatGPT to give me the solution to one of the critical thinking tasks, which I'm about to talk about. And it gave me one which sounded great, but was completely wrong. So I was very happy about that. Apologies for being 55 minutes late. This is a new record. So I just, what are we doing? So this is a large project. Everyone's sort of tackling different aspects. In our UQ engineering graduate outcomes, we require our students to develop critical thinking skills. So there's many parts to these graduate outcomes, but B1 is use creative and critical thinking, systems thinking, analysis, business skills, and decision-making in engineering tasks. So we're promising our graduates, people that employ our graduates and ourselves, that our graduates will be critical thinkers. And seeing as how this is one of our graduate outcomes, we of course assess that they achieve these critical thinking skills. So this is a final exam question. Students are looking at a supersonic business jet that uses ethylene sourced from biomass as fuel, and they're analyzing the feasibility of this. And at the end, we ask them in a few sentences, argue whether this ramjet is a feasible choice for this application, or if an alternative engine would have major advantages. This is a fourth year course I'm teaching. It's aerospace propulsion, which is all about how you make things which fly go forward, and try and do it as efficiently as possible. This is a very rapidly changing space. Within the next few years, there's going to be new fuels, new cycles coming in. And so graduates in this sector are going to have to make a lot of big decisions, and we need them to have the ability to critically evaluate these decisions. So we're requiring that students have this critical thinking ability, and we're testing them on it. We're assessing their capabilities. But I sort of wanted to answer the question of, could we do a better job in scaffolding the development of critical thinking, so that they'd be able to do it more effectively, with less pain. And so I talked to the group about this. It was great having a community that you could go to bounce ideas off. And one of the things which we settled on was kind of the list of aspects of a good critical thinking task, which has identify and challenge assumptions. This was on the slide when I came in, so you probably all looked at it. And what I thought it would do was, or what we thought that we would do, is introduce these different elements sequentially. So rather than throwing them in the deep end with critical thinking tasks with all of these aspects, we introduce them in a sequential manner with lots of support. So this is going to be introduced on formative assessment. So these formative assessment tasks, the sample shown here from a previous year, we ask them to do a little bit of critical thinking, justify your answer. This is looking at the effect of bleeding off some air from a conventional turbojet. And so this year, I kept the same task, but I modified it to include identifying, identifying and challenging assumptions. And they're doing this in groups, and it's a novel situation, so it kind of naturally covers these last 3 points as well. But what we did was to introduce an additional task. So there's already some assumptions in the question. So they identify additional assumptions from the problem definition and think about whether these are justifiable. And they're not, because this is a highly simplified problem. And we also introduced, got them to think about what extra information would they need in order to throw away these unjustified assumptions. So we're kind of introducing that creative questioning as well. Now, before they do this task in a class, I sort of do a demonstration problem where I step through exactly the sort of thinking which I hope they're going to apply to this problem. So that's 1 week. The next week, we're introducing constructing and evaluating arguments. So this time they're looking at the role of a diffuser in a ramjet. And at the end, I'm asking them whether there are any potential drawbacks to adding this component and what would limit the size, and asking them to evaluate how would they evaluate if the benefits of this component would outweigh the drawbacks. So once again, we're asking them to construct a robust argument here. As we move forward, we're asking them to do more and more. So I think the second last tutorial, this is a balloon launched rocket. Turns out if you launch a rocket from a high altitude balloon, even a terrible rocket can achieve single stage to orbit, the holy grail of rocket technology. So we ask them, critically evaluate the practicality of this concept. Why is it not in use? If this is the holy grail and it's so easy, why aren't we using it? And they submit their version of this explanation for feedback. And then we follow this up with critical thinking tasks in the major assignment, which again, they get feedback on before the exam. This one is looking at scramjets for intercontinental travel, the Sydney to London in 2 hours thing. You might gather from the tone of this critical thinking question, it's not that good an idea. So more broadly, do you think the results of your analysis indicate any flaws in the concept of using scramjet for long distance travel? Include the reasoning for your response and suggest at least one alternative approach. You can read the rest of it. Anyway, so they get detailed feedback on this, and they get all of this before the final exam when we pitch that to them in a controlled setting that they have to work on individually. So what happened? The average performance on critical thinking tasks was significantly improved. I don't have the statistics. I haven't gone through and generated them. I apologize. But it was very evident from grading these problems. And in general, this was due to a much greater clarity in their justification for the position taken. And most students attempted these critical thinking tasks, even if they hadn't completed the mathematical analysis. I think they figured they had lots of preparation for this task, and they went and attempted it even if the maths was incomplete. Now, this led to one of the places for further improvement. So many students did rely on their general knowledge of the subject to construct their responses, and sometimes neglected the mathematical analysis that they'd just undertaken. They would say things like, well, in general, this is more efficient than this. And I said, but in the mathematical analysis, you proved it was less efficient. So you can use that. And I think that was due to how I constructed those tasks, where there was almost like a break. And then now we're doing the critical thinking instead of, synthesizing these together. So in the future, I will improve on this aspect and make sure, I model that synthesis of the mathematical analysis and the critical thinking, and require it of the students as well. Okay, sorry for being very, very late. I hope that it was worth the wait. Probably not though.
Thanks, Vince. And thanks everybody for staying. And if you want to get in touch with us, just email us at ctp@uq.edu.au. And we also want to thank Laura over there. Laura's our project coordinator for organising all the events and the great food and everything else. But yeah, Laura's our point person if you want to work with us going forward. Thank you very much. Thanks, team. And thanks everybody here. Yay, team.